Okay, so you're with us today, and we are going straight into something pretty crucial if you are prepping for UPSC mains current affairs and even for prelims too. I mean, this
Uh,
is something you really have to wrap your head around, and that's the kind of gap that exists right now in India's arbitration system when it comes to aviation. Especially given, we have the Bharatiya Vayuyan Adhiniyam 2024, which is pretty progressive.
yeah, absolutely. This is a big deal. And the insights we're going to be unpacking today come from an article in The Hindu. It does a really good job of tracing how India's aviation laws have evolved over time.
Yeah.
And it really hones in on this one critical area that still needs a lot of attention. And that is basically, how do we resolve disputes in this, very intricate and complex industry?
Exactly. So our mission in this deep dive is pretty straightforward. We want to understand why this kind of missing piece, this specialized arbitration system, is so important if India really wants to be a major player, a global hub for aviation. And for you, our listener who's following all of this for UPSC, we want you to understand the significance of this challenge, how it fits into the bigger economic picture. Okay, so to start unpacking all of this, let's go back to the very beginning. Let's talk about the foundation of India's aviation laws.
Okay, so the historical bedrock here, right? The thing you really need to understand is the Aircraft Act of 1934. It's from the colonial era. Now, this act, it served its purpose back then, but it was really all about control, control by the imperial powers. The main goals were administrative oversight and military applications. And it just didn't have the kind of framework you need to really nurture a thriving commercial aviation sector. You could think of it like a regulatory structure that was built for a very different world, a different purpose than what it ended up having to serve.
So it wasn't really designed to support the kind of growth to handle the complex disputes that you see in a modern aviation industry.
Exactly. You hit the nail on the head. As India's aviation sector started expanding, especially the liberalization that brought in all the private airlines and a huge surge in passenger numbers, this act that was, decades old, it just became more and more inadequate. And that led to all these regulatory hurdles. Like, think about the licensing process for new airlines, the inefficiencies in managing air traffic, which was getting busier and busier, and the lack of protection for passengers when there were disruptions. It was a system that was really struggling to keep up with an industry that was changing so rapidly.
I see. So it was a system really trying to catch up, which kind of leads us to the Bharatiya Vayuyan Adhiniyam 2024. This was supposed to be a big leap forward, right? A modernization effort.
Oh, absolutely. The 2024 Adhiniyam is a really progressive step. It was a long time coming, and it really overhauled India's entire aviation framework. It brought in a lot of key improvements, things like streamlined processes for licensing aviation activities, better regulation of air traffic to make it safer and more efficient, and very importantly, stronger protections for air passengers. It was a clear signal that India didn't just want to manage its airspace. It wanted to be a major player in global aviation.
And this is a critical point for our UPSC listeners, even with all these advancements, the new law kind of skips over a very important aspect, and that's how disputes in the aviation sector are actually resolved.
That's it. That's the heart of the issue. The Bharatiya Vayuyan Adhiniyam 2024 is a huge step forward in many ways, but it doesn't really deal with the unique needs of dispute resolution in aviation. And this is a pretty significant omission, because without a reliable and, importantly, a specialized arbitration system, you're going to see commercial disagreements being handled outside of India, which has a big impact on our legal and economic influence in this sector.
Okay, so let's break down this arbitration conundrum. Why isn't the current system under the Arbitration and Conciliation Act of 1996, which handles all kinds of disputes across sectors, why isn't that enough for aviation?
Right. So the Arbitration and Conciliation Act of 1996 basically sets out the general legal structure for resolving disagreements. And it works fine for a lot of industries,
Mm.
but it doesn't have the specific expertise that you need to handle the complexities of aviation disputes. You're often dealing with technical stuff, things related to aeronautical engineering, like maybe a disagreement over the design or maintenance of an aircraft. You've got these complex cross-border regulations that are governed by international treaties on air travel and airspace. You've got agreements for leasing aircraft across different countries and all sorts of international aviation laws. It's not your average commercial contract dispute.
Yeah, that makes sense. You need experts who really understand the language, the technicalities of the aviation world. And the Hindu article pointed out a really striking statistic that highlights this problem.
Yeah, it did. Almost 90% of arbitration cases involving Indian aviation firms are actually being handled in Singapore right now. That's not just a number. It really shows that India isn't quite ready institutionally to deal with this kind of specialized area. And it shows that international companies prefer going to established centers like London and Paris. They're seen as having more expertise and being more impartial when it comes to these highly technical and international matters.
So why is it so important to have this specialized arbitration capability within India? It seems like companies are finding solutions by going overseas. What's the downside for India?
Well, they are finding solutions, but there are downsides for India. First off, not having this kind of expertise in our own arbitration system means that foreign companies, and even some Indian ones, end up going to other countries to resolve their disputes. And this is often because they're worried about bureaucracy and delays, and they're not confident in the local expertise.
And the consequences of this, this preference for foreign arbitration centers go beyond just inconvenience, right?
Oh, absolutely. For one thing, Indian legal professionals and arbitration institutions are losing out on revenue. These are big cases that could be generating economic activity in India. And maybe even more importantly, in the long term, it can hurt India's reputation in the global aviation market. If international businesses always feel like they have to go elsewhere to resolve their disputes, it doesn't exactly project an image of India as a reliable and capable player in this sector.
The article also talked about this idea of judicial overreach in India. Can you explain what that means in the context of arbitration, especially for our UPSC listeners?
Sure. So there have been instances in India where the judiciary has kind of stepped in and interfered with the outcomes of arbitration proceedings. And this goes beyond what's supposed to be the scope of judicial review. This kind of overreach can lead to legal battles that drag on and inconsistent enforcement of arbitration awards. And for international companies, this unpredictability is a big problem. It makes them want to go to places where the arbitration process is seen as more independent and where the awards are enforced more consistently and quickly. It basically undermines the whole point of arbitration, which is supposed to be efficient and final.
So less interference with what the arbitrators decide and more focus on whether the process was fair. Okay, so we recognize this gap. We understand why it's a challenge for India's aviation ambitions. What are some concrete steps that India can take to build a stronger, more attractive arbitration system that's tailored to the aviation sector?
Well, the Hindu analysis had some really good recommendations. First off, we need to create specialized institutions. We need dedicated arbitration bodies that focus specifically on aviation. And these bodies need to have people with deep expertise in aviation law. The technical side of things like aeronautical engineering and all the international regulations that govern air travel and commerce.
So you need the right experts at the table to effectively handle these complex disputes. What else is important?
We also need a much greater emphasis on training and education. Law schools in India and professional development programs should be encouraged to create and offer specialized courses in aviation law and arbitration. This is essential to build up a pool of legal professionals in India who are ready to handle these complex cases in the future.
So investing in the people and the expertise makes sense. What's another important step?
Institutional neutrality. That's absolutely key. We need to create arbitration panels where the arbitrators are chosen either by the parties involved or by a neutral third-party institution. It's really important that these panels are seen as and actually are independent from the government and any undue influence. That's how you build trust and confidence, especially among international companies operating in India's aviation sector.
So neutrality is a cornerstone in attracting international confidence and ensuring a fair process. What about the role of the judiciary in this reform system?
The recommendation here is judicial restraint. The courts need to be more hands-off when it comes to arbitration proceedings and enforcing awards. The goal should be to make enforcement faster and more predictable, which is one of the main reasons why people choose arbitration over traditional litigation in the first place. Less intervention in the details of the case and more focus on whether the arbitration process itself was fair.
So less interference and more trust in the arbitration process. And finally, what's the last piece of this reform puzzle?
Global alignment. India can learn a lot from looking at successful international models, especially places like Singapore and the UK. They've really established themselves as effective centers for handling sector-specific disputes, including aviation. If we adopt best practices from around the world and align our legal framework with global standards, it will make India much more attractive as a hub for aviation arbitration.
This is really helpful. It lays out the steps India needs to take to strengthen its aviation arbitration framework. Now, for you, our listener who's prepping for UPSC exams, it's crucial to see how this specific issue of aviation arbitration actually connects to broader themes that are super relevant to your prep.
Exactly. This isn't just about legal technicalities. It's about India's economic development as a whole. It's about attracting foreign investment and operating effectively on the global stage. A strong and reliable dispute resolution mechanism is a huge factor for international businesses when they're deciding where to invest and operate. Understanding this challenge in the context of aviation gives you a really nuanced perspective that goes beyond just knowing the details of the new law. It shows you how law, infrastructure, international relations, and economic growth are all connected. These are all core areas in the UPSC syllabus.
So to sum it all up, the main takeaway here is that the Bharatiya Vayuyan Adhiniyam 2024 is a really significant and positive step in modernizing India's aviation sector. But not having a strong, neutral, and specialized arbitration framework is still a major obstacle if India wants to be a leading global player in aviation.
I completely agree. A well-functioning arbitration system isn't just a nice-to-have. It's absolutely essential if we want to build investor confidence, keep valuable legal and economic activity within India, and achieve our national goal of becoming a leader in global aviation.
And this brings us to our final thought for you to ponder. Think about how developing these specialized arbitration institutions could impact not just the aviation sector, but India's overall standing in international commerce and dispute resolution. What other sectors in India's rapidly growing economy could benefit from similar reforms in their dispute resolution mechanisms?
And for those of you studying hard for your UPSC exams, we really encourage you to think critically about how these interconnected issues, law, infrastructure, international relations, and economic development, are vital to your preparation. Don't just look at legislative changes in isolation. Think about the whole ecosystem that needs to be in place for real sustainable progress.
If you found this deep dive insightful and helpful as you prep for your UPSC exams, please like and subscribe to our channel for more in-depth discussions. And we'd love to hear your thoughts and any questions you might have in the comments below. This deep dive was based on an article we analyzed from The Hindu. Thanks for joining us today.